Hi guys, welcome back. This is Hamid and today is day 4th of learning web development.
Let's learn about CSS grid layout fundamentals. We'll be learning the CSS properties that you will use most frequently when working with grids. So for starter code, we've got HTML here, and inside the body we have a main element with the class of container, and we have 6 divs labeled box 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 by their content. They all have the same class box. If we look at the style that is currently applied, you can see we're importing in the Roboto font from Google Fonts. We have a basic CSS reset. Inside the body, we are just setting the Roboto font and setting the body to a min height of 100 viewport units. And then we have the box class for those divs, background color of black, a white font color, and font size 2 rem, padding of 0.5 rem. And that's all we have to start. So I'll drag VS Code over to the left, and we're using the Live Server Visual Studio Code extension. So any changes we make to the CSS, we should see immediately here in Chrome on the web page. So here are our 6 divs. Now we haven't set any size. The main element is a block element, so it automatically has 100% width. And then so are the divs, so they're stacked on top of each other, and all 6 of them have a width of 100%, so they're filling up that main element. We're going to cover several different ways to apply grid to our page and to these divs. So let's start out by styling that container class that we have on the main element, and we'll say display grid. Now instantly when we do this and save, we don't see a change, but all of these divs instantly become grid items now within the grid. After that, the quickest way to apply a grid is to use grid-auto-flow, and you can say row, which essentially leaves it as it is because they're stacked on top of each other, which now makes 6 rows. Or we could change this to column, and we will have 6 columns, one.
So we have 6 boxes.
one for each of the 6 divs. Now, many times we want more control than just setting the auto flow to column and letting all the columns be defined just automatically like that. So let me go ahead and remove grid auto flow, and in its place I'm going to put grid dash template dash, whoops, there we go, dash columns. That's what I want. And now we can set the columns and the width of each. Now notice I'm wrapping the code, so it will wrap to the next line, but I'll say 200 pixels, then I could say 100 pixels, and then I could say 200 pixels. And when I save, we now have 3 columns, and you can see the first column is 200 pixels, the second is 100, and the third is again 200. But we don't have to use absolute values like pixels. We can use fraction units, which is a unit that's specifically used with CSS grids. So let's say we've got 2 fractions for the first column, and then 1 fraction for the second, and 1 fraction for the third. Now when we save, you can see it used all of the available space, but it made the first column twice as big as it did the second or the third column.
So we have grid template columns. So we can give like 2 fractions, 1 fraction, 1 fraction, it will become 3 columns. Here 1.5. Hi Yokesh, konnichiwa. Yokesh sensei. Daijobu, daijobu, daijobu.
And we can also mix, so we could say 200 pixels and then 1 fraction, 1 fraction, and you see our first column's 200 pixels. Then the next 2 columns, since they're equal, both have 1 fraction apiece, they're splitting the available width that is remaining, and so they're eating up all of that. So it still has a 100% width for the row, but the 5 and 6 here, or the 2 and 3, are much wider than what we see for the 1 and the 4. And now something very useful, instead of specifying every column, especially if many of the columns have the same value, you can use a shortcut for that. And so we're going to say repeat. I could spell repeat, and let's say we have 4 columns and each one is 1 fraction. And now when we save, you can see we have 4 equal columns, each being 1 fraction. And then when we get to the second row that is automatically created by grid, we've got 2 columns here because we only had 6 total grid items. So a grid can have empty space, and that's what we have here to the right. Now, while this value does not always
So we can also use grid template columns and repeat. Which is 4 2 fraction. One fraction is nothing happens. Nothing happens.
have to be equal, it does have to be a pattern. So we could say, instead of just 1 fraction, let's say we start with 1 fraction and then the next column is 2 fractions, and instead of repeating 4, let's just repeat this twice because it's going to repeat this pattern. So with this pattern we're going to have 4 columns because we've defined 2 different columns here with the pattern. So when I save, you can see the first column is 1 fraction, the second column is twice as big, 2 fractions, the third column again 1 fraction, and the fourth column following that. pattern is twice as big with two fractions. Now, while we've defined our columns here, we really haven't applied anything to the rows. So everything about the rows is currently implicitly created by CSS Grid. We haven't explicitly defined anything for those rows, but let's go ahead and do that. And to do that, we'll use grid-auto-rows, and let's say 200 pixels to start out. And you can see now each row became 200 pixels tall. But once again, we're not locked into just using 200 pixels here with grid auto rows. So we could say min max, which is a function, and this lets us say the minimum first. So we'll say a minimum of, let's say, 150 pixels tall, and then we'll say auto for the max, so it could allow it to be taller. So now both rows are essentially function, and this lets us say the minimum first. So we'll say a minimum 100 pixels here with grid auto rows. So, but once again, we're not locked into just now each row became, and to do that we'll use grid-auto-rows, and let's say 200 pixels to start out. And you can see now each row became 200 pixels tall. But once again, we're not locked into just using 200 pixels here with grid auto rows. So we could say min max, which is a function, and this lets us say the minimum first. So we'll say a minimum of, let's say, 150 pixels tall, and then we'll say auto for the max, so it could allow it to be taller. So now both rows are essentially 150 pixels tall.
Min content, I don't know, some min. It was grid auto rows min max.
But we have a min max, which is a function, and this lets us say the minimum first. So we'll say a minimum of, let's say, 150 pixels tall, and then we'll say auto for the max, so it could allow it to be taller. So now both rows are essentially 150 pixels tall, but we have auto here. So if our container was taller, right now we've got 150 and 150, so that would be a total of 300. But if our container was taller, this auto would let it grow. So let's set a height, or let's set a min height. I like that better. Let's set a min height of 400 pixels and save. And now you can see they got taller. They should be 200 each. So 200 height on the first row, 200 height on the second row, and that's because of this auto. But they will not get smaller than 150 pixels a piece per row. Now, while I'm giving this example of grid template rows and grid template columns, and grid auto rows, you should know that the opposite also exists. So you could have grid template rows, and you could have grid auto columns. So I'm giving one example, and I'll let you play around with the opposite of those. Now, what else we have are gaps between the rows or between the columns. So we could define a row dash gap, and we could set that to 1em and save, and you can see we now have that gap between the rows. Likewise, there is a column dash gap, so instead we could say column gap and save, and now we have 1em as a gap between each of the columns. Now these spaces are essentially called gutters. That's the space between the cells. So it could be a column gap, a row gap, or we could just define it as gap. And as you might guess, gap combines both, and it will define the row first. So if we say row 1 EM, and just to show the difference, we could say 0.5 EM for the column and save, and you can see the column gap is smaller. So you can define each of those separately. Many times we want them all to be the same, and we just leave it all at one size. And while I've got EM there, I kind of want to make that rem instead, so I know I'm going back to my default font size there. Okay, now let's look at the individual grid items, which we have applied the class of box to all of them. So let's use pseudo selectors to just select the ones we want to change. And I'll start off with the box class, and then I'll use the pseudo selector first dash child. And after first child, I'm going to set the background color first. So background color, there we go. And I'll make this blue. We can save and make sure we have selected the correct grid item, that first child. And after that, let's go ahead and define how many columns this child takes up. And this is based on the lines of the grid, which I will explain after I set this definition. So let's say grid dash column. Yeah, there we go, column. Then we say dash start, and we'll start at 1. And then we'll say grid dash column dash end, and let's end at 4. And now if I save, well, that looks way different, doesn't it? So what we have done, the first line is here on the left hand side of the grid. The second line is here when we get to the second column. The third line is here when we get to the third column. And the fourth line is over here after the third column and before the fourth column. And so you can see we told it to start at the first line and end at the fourth line. So it really spans the first 3 columns. We can do the same with the row. So let's say grid dash row dash start, and we'll go ahead and start again at 1. Then we'll say grid dash row dash end, and let's end at 3 and save and see what happens. When that happens, we took up 2 rows. So the starting line was at the top, and then the second line was between the first and second row, and the third line is between the second and third row. So when we told it to stop at line 3, it stops before the third row. Now we can see this better with DevTools. So I'm going to drag our page over so it takes up the full window, and then I'm going to press Control Shift and the letter I to get to DevTools.
So we can load the box first child. So start at 1, grid row start at 1, okay, then it's end row and at 3. So this is row, this is the column. Now I get it. It's easy. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Hi guys. Hi Yoksh. Hi Yoksh. King Riska.
See this better with DevTools. So I'm going to drag our page over so it takes up the full window, and then I'm going to press Control Shift and the letter I to get to DevTools, and then I want to go to Elements, I believe. Yep, and I'm going to drag this up, and no, we don't need the console. Let's look at Layout. There we go. So I don't need to drag that up. I need to bring this down. Maybe I can close that. There we go. So now we're in Layout here, not Styles, not Computed, but Layout, and we can scroll up and we can overlay the grid on our main container and look at it in the browser. So now we see this, and the lines are labeled. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. Likewise, at the top we have 1, and then 2, and then 3 coming down. So for the row we start at 1 and we end at 3. For the column we start at 1 and end at 4. And you can always do this in Chrome DevTools. Just make sure you open it up, go down to this second area here, and not Styles, not Computed, but choose Layout, and then you can go to Grid Overlays. And there are some other things that you can apply as well. It should default to show line numbers, and that's what you definitely want when you see the overlays. Okay, with that said, I'm going to close this, going to drag our Chrome window back to the right so we can see our code, and let's apply just a little bit more to this grid. I'm going to scroll up for just a little more room, and I'm going to show you what I do instead of typing all of these out, because this gets to be a little bit much. So instead of grid column start and end and grid row start and end, I would type grid dash column, and then I would specify start at the first line, then put a slash and end at the fourth. And if I save, you can see that's what happens. Likewise, I can do that with grid dash row and say start at the first line, end at the third line, and save. And we're back to where we were with fewer properties, as long as you understand that these are shorthand, and this essentially is the starting number and the ending number for both of these properties. Let's go ahead and select one more of these grid items. So I'll once again use the box class, and now I'll use nth-child, and we'll select the second item. Now for the second item, we'll change the background color once again, and I'll make this one purple so it stands out. And we save, we can see that it is now up in the top right. After that, we'll come down to the next line, and let's put our grid dash column, and let's say it starts at the first line but ends at the fifth, and that should make it span the entire row, or the entire container, if you will. So when I save, That made a big change right there. Then let's use grid row, say grid dash row. Let's have it start at the 3rd line and end at the 4th line. And when I save, you can see that made some changes too. Now, instead of 3 and 4 being below it, they came back up here by default in the grid. So again, that's implicit. The grid is calculating where to put everything that we do not explicitly tell it to. And now, just like Flexbox, where something that was a flex item could also be a flex container, we can do that with grid too. So we can nest a grid inside of a grid item. So I'm going to take this first child and put display and set that to grid. And now inside of that, I'm going to say align dash content. And just to change it up here, I'm going to say end to begin with, and we save. And look what it did. It took the number 1 down here to the bottom. So it aligned the content to the end. As you might guess, you could choose center, and you could have start as well. So what I'm going to do is say center, and then after center, I'm also going to say justify content, and we could say for that it could be start. And if we save, you can see that's to the left and end all the way to the right. And if we say center, it should be right in the middle. So now we have centered both vertically and horizontally. So that's how you can center with grid. But we can shorten this up by using the place content shorthand. And then we could say both properties. So we could say end and center, and I'll get rid of these other two, and you'll see what happens. The first one is the align content, so it's at the bottom, but then horizontally it's centered because that is the justify content, and this is the align content. But if we just put one value, it takes that value for both. So we can just say place content center and center anything we want to. Inside of a grid. So now we've looked at how you can quickly use AutoFlow to create a grid, or how you can place grid template columns and rows and then assign different starting and ending points to put the grid items basically anywhere you want them in the grid. But there is another way to set up grids too, and that is with named grid items and grid template areas. So let's do that now, but we'll continue to keep this on our page as part of the page. So I'm going to go back to the HTML, and I'm going to drag Visual Studio Code back over to the full window to start out. Okay, we want to add a header element first, and it's going to have two classes. We'll give it a header class and then just an EL class for element. I'll put an H1 element inside the header, and I'll just say header for that. After that, give it a header class and then just an EL first. And it's going to have two classes. We'll give it a header class and then just an EL class for element. I'll put an H1 element inside the header, and I'll just say header for that. After that, we'll have our main element. Then we'll have an aside element that is going to have a sidebar class and also the EL class. Inside the aside element, I'm going to use an H2, and we'll just say sidebar inside this H2. We'll do much the same for the footer. So a footer element with a class of footer and a class of EL for element. And then inside of that, we'll use H2 and we'll say footer as well. So let's save our HTML. And you can see we've now outlined more of a traditional page with a header, a main area, an aside, and a footer. I'm going to jump back to the style page and drag Visual Studio Code back over to the left. And now you can see this on the page. We've got a header at the top, a sidebar, and a footer. They're not much to look at. You can just see the text, not really an outline of the elements at all. They are block elements, so they are expanding 100% across the page right now. I'm going to scroll all the way back up, and we're going to make the body element of the page a grid container. So we'll start out by saying display grid. And then we'll say grid dash template dash columns, and let's set this to repeat, and we'll have 9 columns, and we'll use 1 fraction for each column. So let's save that, and boy, did we see some changes on the page. This is going to drastically change from here though as well. So now let's say grid dash auto dash rows, and we'll say 75 pixels, and then we'll say auto, and then we'll say 75 pixels again, and let's save. And that didn't change too much, but it will here in the near future, because we're going to say grid dash template dash areas. Now this is where we can define names of our items on the page, but we're also going to have to apply these to each item. But we're going to call our header HD. So I'm going to tab in just a little bit, and this would be HD. Now we have 9 columns, and this is where we can really visualize our grid. And I may need to pull Visual Studio Code back over to get some more room, but I'm going to type HD 9 times, once for each column. So there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yep, I'm going to go ahead and bring Visual Studio Code back over. And then once we have the full page, we'll be able to visualize this better. And then we'll come back and look at our browser afterwards. So now we've got main, which will be named MN. I'm going to use it. And we're putting it in for each column. But when I get to the last 2, I'm going to put an SB for sidebar that will be to the right of the main element. And then, as you might guess, at the bottom, oh, we need quotes first. I'm going to put FT for footer. And now this is kind of visualizing how our page is going to look. This is going to be the header. This is going to be the main area. The SB will be the sidebar, and then the footer will be across the bottom. But with all of this, it won't apply yet because we haven't defined those areas. We haven't really named them on the items yet. I'm going to save this much, and now let's scroll down and define. The rest of this. So after the body definition, let's go ahead and define that EL that we applied, the class that we applied to these new elements, and we'll give them a background color of Rebecca purple. It's just a little bit different than the other purple we used. A color of white. We'll set each one of these to a display that's grid, and we'll just center the content that we put in, which were essentially the labels. Okay, after that, we need to go ahead and identify each class that we applied. So we'll have our header, and this is where we can define our name. So we'll just say grid-area, set that to HD, is what we have in our template for the header. Okay, so now let's do the same for the sidebar. So we'll say .sidebar because we have a class for that. This will be grid-area. This will be SB, but let's go ahead and color the sidebar as well. So background color here is going to be blue. And then we also have a footer. So we'll say .footer for the class. And here we'll say grid-area, set that to FT. So now we should be good, except we haven't named our main area yet. So you can see everything else in the grid. So let's just come down to our container, and that is the main element. And here we'll put grid-area, and we'll name it MN for main, and save. Now let's go ahead and pull Visual Studio Code back to the left and see what we have. Well, that looks pretty good. We've got our header across the top. We've got our sidebar on the right. We've got our footer at the bottom. And here is our main element, the container that we were previously working with that still has our grid. So now this is a nested grid. And then inside of this nested grid, we created this grid item and made it a grid so we could center the content, so it's nested once again. I think the only thing I may want to add would be some space for our grid that's on the body. So after we've defined this, and you can see it's scrunched now with the lines wrapping, but here I'm going to put a gap, once again say 1 rem. And so now, well, now I have an error because I didn't put a semicolon at the end of our template areas, which is very easy to do. So let's save that, bring it back, and now I'll say gap and 1 rem. And now we can see this gap. Now it pushes our page down here just a little bit when we did that, so we might need to change that, resize something. But overall, we've got a gap of 1 rem between the header and the main element and the sidebar. Once again, we see that gap between the sidebar and main element and footer, and then we see that right here with the column as well. So let me drag this over to take up the rest of the page. And once again, I'm going to press Control, Shift, and I to open up DevTools. We're going to look at the layout, scroll up, and do the overlay here. So we want to overlay the body now. And now we see the body has 9 columns. And we can see each one of these columns defined, but here's the only one that we really see the gap on for the column, which is right here around line number 8. Now we do see the gap here around line number 2 for the row, and then once again around, I can see a line number down here, but right here as well, no, not right here, here it is, line number 3 down here between the footer and the main element as well. So we had a similar sized gap here inside of our nested grid, which was throwing me off. So we could change that as well. We could change pretty much anything we want to. So for that, let me go ahead, close the DevTools, just to get everything to fit a little bit better. Let's bring this back, change our gap to 0.5 rem, and let's also go ahead and change the size we're using here from 75, and I'll select both of those, to 50 pixels. And yeah, it's fitting on the page a little bit better. There's no scroll up or down now. And we might even just want to have a column gap instead of a row gap. So if we save and do that, you can see now we've got a small footer, a small header, and we have this small column gap here. Now it doesn't match the column gap inside our nested grid. So there could be other styles we want to change and play around with. But overall, I hope this has helped you see how grid can be applied in many different ways and give you a good start. And much like Flexbox Froggy that I recommended at the end of the Flexbox module, let's go ahead and look at Grid Garden, which is a game that will help you learn how to use CSS Grid as well. I'll link to this in the description. It's at cssgridgarden.com. But once again, 28 different challenges here that will help you master CSS Grid, or at least learn a lot more about it.
This is your brain when you're struggling to focus. And this is your brain
So by